The barber had been cutting hair in Louisville for 40 years when Muhammad Ali walked in without an appointment. He didn't ask if the barber had time. He just sat in the chair and waited. The barber picked up his scissors and started cutting in silence. After 10 minutes, the barber stopped mid-cut and said, "The question you came to ask, I already know it, and I'm not sure you want to hear the answer." The barbershop sat on West Walnut Street, 3 blocks from the railroad tracks, in a part of Louisville that hadn't changed much since 1946. The building was narrow, wedged between a laundromat and a vacant storefront that used to be a hardware store. The sign outside read Earl's Barbershop in faded letters that had once been gold but had weathered to a dull yellow-brown. The awning was striped red and white, torn in 2 places, patched with duct tape that had itself begun to deteriorate. Inside, the shop was a museum of mid-century working-class America. 3 barber chairs, the kind with green vinyl seats and chrome footrests, faced a long mirror that ran the length of the wall. The mirror had aged, developing dark spots around its edges where the silver backing had worn away. A shelf beneath the mirror held jars of blue barbicide, combs standing upright like soldiers, and bottles of hair tonic with labels so old the text had faded to illegibility. The floor was black and white checkered linoleum, worn smooth in paths between the chairs and the door. A wooden bench sat against the opposite wall, its seat cushion compressed from decades of waiting customers. Beside it stood a metal magazine rack holding copies of Jet, Ebony, and Sport from various years, none more recent than 1964. A clock on the wall, advertising Coca-Cola, ran 5 minutes slow. It had been running 5 minutes slow since 1952. Earl Washington had opened this shop in January 1946, 3 weeks after returning from the war. He'd served with the 92nd Infantry Division in Italy, come home to Louisville with a Purple Heart and enough saved pay to rent this space and buy 3 used barber chairs from an estate sale. He was 24 years old then. Now, in October 1966, he was 64, his hair completely white, his hands marked with age spots but still steady when they held scissors. Earl had cut hair for presidents of local churches, factory workers from the Ford plant on South 3rd Street, teachers from Central High School, porters from the train station, and thousands of children brought in by their mothers every Saturday morning. He knew every head in the West End of Louisville, knew their cowlicks, their growth patterns, the way their hair lay, knew their stories, their troubles, their small victories. In 1952, he'd cut the hair of a 10-year-old boy named Cassius Clay Jr., brought in by his mother Odessa on a Saturday afternoon in July. The boy had been skinny, all elbows and knees, talking constantly about a bicycle that had been stolen from him and a police officer who'd told him if he wanted to whoop the thief, he'd better learn how to fight. Earl had listened while cutting, the way barbers do, and thought nothing particular about the boy except that he talked faster than most children and had eyes that didn't settle on anything for long. He'd continued cutting Cassius Clay Jr.'s hair through 1954, through 1955, watching the boy fill out, develop muscles, develop confidence. The boy started coming in alone instead of with his mother. Started talking about boxing instead of bicycles. Earl had listened, offered occasional advice. "Keep your head steady, that's what my drill sergeant always said," and charged 75 cents per cut. Then in 1956, the boy stopped coming. Earl heard through other customers that Cassius was training seriously now, getting good, winning local tournaments. The boy was spending all his time at the Columbia Gym on Grace Street, working with a trainer named Fred Stoner. No time for Saturday haircuts at Earl's. Earl followed Cassius Clay's career the way everyone in Louisville's West End did, with pride mixed with skepticism. Pride that one of their own was succeeding. Skepticism that the success would last, or that the white world would let a black boy from Louisville rise too high. When Cassius won gold at the Rome Olympics in 1960, Earl had the newspaper clipping taped to his mirror for 3 weeks. When Cassius turned professional and started calling himself the Louisville Lip, started predicting which round he'd win in, Earl shook his head with a smile that contained both amusement and concern. The last time Earl had seen Cassius Clay was February 1964, the day before he fought Sonny Liston for the heavyweight championship. Cassius had been driving through Louisville, had stopped at a gas station 3 blocks from Earl's shop. Earl had been walking to get lunch and saw him. They'd talked for maybe 5 minutes. Cassius was confident, electric, talking about how he was going to shock the world. Earl had told him, "Don't let confidence make you careless." Cassius had laughed and said, "Worry makes you careless. Confidence makes you careful." Then he'd driven off. The next night, Cassius Clay became the heavyweight champion of the world. 3 days later, he announced he'd joined the Nation of Islam and changed his name to Muhammad Ali. Earl had read about it in the papers, watched it create controversy throughout Louisville, throughout America. He'd cut hair and listened to his customers debate whether the name change was noble or foolish, whether Ali was brave or misguided, whether boxing would survive this or be destroyed by it. Earl had his own thoughts, but he kept them to himself. Barbers learned early that the chair was for listening, not talking. The customer did the talking, the barber did the cutting. That was the arrangement. Now it was October 12, 1966, a Wednesday afternoon at 2:35 p.m. Earl was alone in the shop. His assistant, a young man named Jerome who helped with sweeping and shining shoes, had gone to cash a check at the bank. Earl was sweeping hair from the morning's customers into a pile near the back room when the bell above the door rang. He looked up. Muhammad Ali stood in the doorway. Earl recognized him immediately despite the years. The boy had become a man, filled out, developed the physique of a professional fighter. He was wearing simple clothes, dark pants, a white shirt with no tie, a lightweight jacket. No entourage, no cameras, no handlers, just Ali standing in the doorway of a barbershop he hadn't entered in more than a decade. For a moment, neither man spoke. The clock on the wall ticked. Traffic passed on Walnut Street. Somewhere in the laundromat next door, a dryer was running. Earl leaned the broom against the wall. "Mr. Ali," he said quietly. Not Cassius, not Clay. He used the name Ali had chosen. Ali nodded. "Earl, you need a haircut?" Ali walked into the shop without answering. He looked around, taking in the unchanged space, the familiar chairs, the aging mirror, the old magazines. His expression was difficult to read. Not nostalgic, not uncomfortable, something else. He walked to the first chair, the same chair he'd sat in as a boy, and sat down without waiting for Earl to drape him with the cutting cape. Earl picked up a clean cape from the counter, shook it out, and draped it over Ali's shoulders. He fastened it at the neck. Ali's eyes met his in the mirror. Earl picked up his scissors and comb from the jar of Barbershop, shook off the excess blue liquid, and stepped behind the chair. He began cutting without asking how Ali wanted it cut. After 40 years, Earl could look at a head and know what it needed. Ali's hair was longer than he'd worn it as a boy, but not styled in any particular way. It needed shaping, needed the edges cleaned up. Earl started at the temple, working methodically, the way he'd learned from his own teacher in 1945. Neither man spoke. The scissors made their familiar sound. Snip, snip, snip. Hair fell onto the cape, onto Ali's shoulders, onto the floor. Earl worked with the precision of 4 decades of practice. His hands didn't shake. His breathing was steady. He moved around the chair with the economy of motion that comes from repeating the same movements thousands of times. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was weighted. Both men seemed to understand that this wasn't a normal haircut, that Ali hadn't walked into this shop after 12 years because he needed a trim. Earl stopped cutting. The comb was still raised, the scissors still open, but his hands had gone still. He was looking at Ali's reflection in the mirror. "The question you came to ask," Earl said quietly. "I already know it." Ali's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "And I'm not sure you want to hear the answer," Earl continued. For a long moment, Ali didn't respond. Then he spoke, his voice softer than the voice the world knew from press conferences and interviews. "How do you know what I came to ask?" Earl set down his scissors and comb on the counter. He moved around the chair so he was standing beside Ali, looking at him directly instead of through the mirror. "Because you didn't come here for a haircut," Earl said. "You came here because this is the last place you remember being before everything changed. Before Rome. Before Liston. Before the name. Before the religion. Before the world decided who you were supposed to be. You came back to the place where you were just a boy who talked too much and dreamed too big. And you came to ask me if that boy would recognize who you've become. Ali's jaw clenched slightly. His hands, hidden under the cape, gripped the armrests of the chair. That's not exactly the question, Ali said. No? Earl leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. Then what is? Ali was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his words came slowly, carefully chosen. The question is whether I should keep going. Whether what I'm doing, the fighting, the speaking, the stand I'm taking, whether it matters, or whether I'm just a man who got famous and confused fame with purpose. Earl nodded slowly. That's a harder question than the one I thought you came to ask. But I think I know the answer to that one too. What is it? Earl walked over to the bench against the wall and sat down. His knees ached from standing all day, and this conversation wasn't going to be quick. Before I answer, Earl said, I need to tell you something. Something I don't think I ever told you, even when you were a boy coming in here every month. Ali turned in the chair to face him, the cape still around his shoulders, hair half cut. I was at Omaha Beach, Earl said, June 6, 1944. I was with the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. We were one of the few all-black units that landed on D-Day. You know what our job was? Ali shook his head. We set up and maintained barrage balloons, big inflatable things that floated above the beach to prevent German planes from flying low and strafing the troops. Critical work, life or death work, but not glory work. Nobody makes movies about the men who held the balloon strings while other men charged up the beach. Earl's voice was matter-of-fact, not bitter, just stating reality. We did our job. We kept those balloons up. We saved lives by doing it. And when the day was done and the beach was secured and the reporters came to write their stories, not one of them mentioned the 320th. Not one photograph showed our faces. We were essential and invisible at the same time. Ali was listening with complete attention now, his earlier restlessness gone. I came home in 1945, Earl continued. Got my discharge papers. Took my medals home in a cardboard box. Came back to Louisville, where I couldn't eat in half the restaurants I'd been defending. Couldn't sleep in half the hotels. Couldn't vote without taking a literacy test designed to make sure I'd fail. And I had to decide, do I spend the rest of my life angry about that? Or do I find a different way to matter? What did you choose? Ali asked quietly. I opened this shop. I started cutting hair. I started listening to people. And I realized something that took me years to understand. The work isn't about whether people notice you. The work is about whether you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Whether you're living according to what you know is right, regardless of who's watching or who's judging. Earl leaned forward, his forearms on his knees. You asked me if what you're doing matters. Here's what I think. Every Saturday morning, mothers bring their sons into this shop. And almost every one of those boys, at some point during the haircut, talks about you. They talk about how you won the gold medal, how you beat Sonny Liston, how you changed your name and didn't apologize for it, how you speak up when everyone tells you to be quiet. And you know what I hear in their voices when they talk about you? What? Permission. You're giving them permission to imagine that they could be more than what this city, this country, tells them they're allowed to be. You're showing them that a black man from Louisville can stand in front of the whole world and say, this is who I am and I'm not changing for you. That matters, Muhammad. That matters more than you probably know. Ali's eyes were glistening, but he didn't look away. But here's the other part, Earl said, the part that's harder to hear. That kind of mattering comes with a price. The world doesn't forgive people who refuse to stay in their assigned place. You know that already. You're feeling it right now. The government wants to draft you. The boxing commissions want to strip your title. Half the country wants to call you a coward, and the other half doesn't know what to call you. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. I know, Ali said quietly. So the question isn't whether what you're doing matters. It does. The question is whether you can keep paying the price that mattering requires. Whether you can stand in front of that draft board and refuse induction, knowing it might cost you everything. Whether you can sit in a prison cell if it comes to that, knowing those boys in my barbershop are watching to see if you meant what you said. Ali's hands emerged from under the cape. They were shaking slightly. I don't know if I can, he admitted. That's why I came here. I needed someone who knew me before all of this started. Someone who remembers when I was just a kid who wouldn't shut up about a stolen bicycle. I needed to know if that kid would think I was doing the right thing, or if he'd think I lost my way. Earl stood up from the bench. His knees protested, but he ignored them. He walked over to the chair and put his hand on Ali's shoulder. That kid you're talking about? The one who came in here in 1952 with his mother. He talked my ear off for 30 minutes about that bicycle, about how it was stolen and how unfair it was, and how he was going to learn to fight so he could whoop whoever took it. You remember what I told you that day? Ali shook his head. I told you that learning to fight to whoop somebody was the wrong reason, but learning to fight to protect something you love, that was worth the work. That bicycle wasn't really what you were mad about. You were mad about the unfairness, about the injustice of having something taken from you that you'd worked for. And that anger, that sense that things should be fair even when they're not, that was good. That was worth protecting. Earl's grip on Ali's shoulder tightened slightly. That kid would recognize you, Muhammad. He'd recognize the anger. He'd recognize the sense of injustice. He'd recognize the refusal to accept what everyone else accepts as normal. The only difference between that boy and you sitting in this chair right now is that the boy thought the fight was about a bicycle. You know now that the fight is about something bigger. But it's the same fight. It's always been the same fight. Ali wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. What if I can't win it? He asked. What if they put me in prison? What if they take everything? Then those boys in this barbershop will watch you lose with dignity instead of win with compromise. And maybe that teaches them something even more important. Maybe that teaches them that some things are worth losing everything for. Earl walked back around the chair and picked up his scissors and comb. Now sit still and let me finish this haircut. Can't have you walking out of here looking half done. He resumed cutting. His hands were steady. The scissors made their familiar sound. Ali sat quietly, his breathing slow and controlled, his eyes focused on something in the mirror that might have been his own reflection or might have been something else entirely. Earl worked for another 15 minutes, shaping and refining, making sure every line was clean. When he finished, he used clippers for the edges, then a straight razor for the neckline. He removed the cape carefully, shook the hair onto the floor, and used a soft brush to remove any remaining clippings from Ali's neck and shoulders. Ali stood up from the chair. He looked at himself in the mirror, turned his head side to side, checking Earl's work. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. What do I owe you? He asked. Same as always, Earl said, 75 cents. Ali pulled out a $20 bill and set it on the counter. Keep it, he said. That's too much. It's not enough, but it's what I have today. Earl picked up the bill and put it in his register. He made change and held it out. Ali waved it away. Give it to the next kid who comes in here talking too much about bicycles and justice. Earl nodded. I will. Ali walked toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the knob. He turned back. Earl, can I ask you one more thing? Of course. Do you think I'm doing the right thing, refusing the draft? Earl was quiet for a moment. This was the question beneath all the other questions, the one Ali had come here to have answered. I think you're doing the only thing you can do and still live with yourself, Earl said finally. I don't know if it's right or wrong, I just know it's true. And truth is harder than right or wrong. Ali absorbed this, nodded slowly, then pushed open the door. The bell rang. He stepped out onto Walnut Street. Then Earl picked up his broom and resumed sweeping hair into a pile. His hands were shaking now, just slightly. Not from age, from the weight of the conversation. From the knowledge that he'd just told a young man, barely 24 years old, that standing on principle might cost him everything. The door opened again. Jerome, his assistant, came back from the bank. Any customers while I was gone? Jerome asked. One, Earl said. Anyone I know? Earl paused, thinking about how to answer. Then he said simply, just someone who needed to remember something. Jerome started organizing magazines on the bench, didn't ask for elaboration. Earl finished sweeping the hair into the dustpan. As he dumped it into the trash can in the back room, he noticed that mixed in with the day's clippings was the hair he'd just cut from Muhammad Ali. It looked no different than anyone else's hair. Just dark strands, cut and discarded, destined for the trash. But Earl knew better. Those clippings represented something more than a haircut. They represented a moment when a young man had come back to the place where his journey began to ask if he was still on the right path. And they represented the answer Earl had given, not the comforting answer or the easy answer, but the true answer. The answer that said, yes, you're on the right path, and yes, it's going to cost you everything, and yes, you should keep walking it anyway. On April 28, 1967, 6 months after that haircut, Muhammad Ali refused induction into the United States Armed Forces. He was immediately stripped of his boxing title and his license to fight. He was convicted of draft evasion and sentenced to 5 years in prison. The conviction would be tied up in appeals for years, keeping him in legal limbo, unable to box, unable to earn a living in the profession he'd dedicated his life to. Earl read about it in the newspapers, watched it on the evening news, heard his customers debate it endlessly in the shop. Some supported Ali, some condemned him, some couldn't decide. Earl listened to all of them and said very little. But every time a young boy came into the shop talking about Muhammad Ali, talking about how he stood up to the government, how he refused to compromise, how he lost his title but kept his principles, Earl would think about that October afternoon in 1966 when Ali had sat in his chair and asked if it mattered. Yes, Earl would think, it matters. In 1971, the Supreme Court overturned Ali's conviction in a unanimous decision. Ali returned to boxing. He fought his way back to the championship, regaining his title in 1974 by defeating George Foreman in Zaire. He became one of the most beloved athletes in the world, proving that principle and success weren't mutually exclusive after all. Earl Washington continued cutting hair until 1982, when arthritis in his hands finally forced him to retire at the age of 80. He sold the shop to Jerome, who renamed it but kept everything else exactly the same: the chairs, the mirror, the magazine rack, even the Coca-Cola clock that ran 5 minutes slow. Earl died in 1987 at the age of 85. His funeral was held at 5th Street Baptist Church, attended by more than 300 people whose hair he'd cut over 40 years. Muhammad Ali wasn't there. He was in the early stages of Parkinson's disease by then, his public appearances becoming rarer, but he sent flowers with a card that read, "Thank you for the haircut. Thank you for the truth." Muhammad. Earl's son, Marcus, who'd been sweeping the shop that October day in 1966, spoke at the funeral. He told the story of the afternoon Muhammad Ali had walked in without an appointment and stayed for more than an hour. He told how his father had spoken to Ali with a combination of gentleness and honesty that Marcus had never heard him use with any other customer. He told how, after Ali left, Earl had sat on the bench for 20 minutes without moving, just staring at the chair where Ali had sat. Marcus had asked his father what was wrong. Earl had looked at him with tears in his eyes and said, "I just told a young man to sacrifice everything for what he believes in. I hope to God I was right." "Were you right?" Marcus had asked. "I don't know yet," Earl had said. "Ask me in 20 years. Speaking at his father's funeral 21 years later, Marcus said, "I'm asking now, Dad, and I think you were right. I think Muhammad Ali walked into your shop that day needing permission to be brave, and you gave it to him, not because you were sure it would work out, but because you knew that some things matter more than working out. Some things matter because they're true." In 2016, when Muhammad Ali died, journalists and biographers combed through his life, searching for the moments that defined him. They wrote about the Olympics, about Liston, about the draft refusal, about Zaire, about Manila. They wrote about his conversion to Islam, his friendship with Malcolm X, his activism, his poetry, his charisma. Very few wrote about a barbershop on West Walnut Street in Louisville. Very few knew about Earl Washington, a barber who'd served in World War II and spent 40 years cutting hair and listening to people's stories. Very few knew about an October afternoon in 1966 when a young man sat in a chair and asked an old man if he should keep fighting. But the people who did know, the customers who'd been in that shop, the neighbors who'd known Earl, the family who'd heard the story, they understood that sometimes the most important moments in history happen in ordinary places. in barbershops and diners and quiet rooms where two people have a conversation that changes everything. Muhammad Ali had walked into that shop carrying a question he couldn't answer alone. He'd walked out carrying an answer that would define the rest of his life. That mattering comes with a price, and the price is worth paying. Earl Washington had given him that answer, not because he was wise or prophetic or knew how things would turn out, but because he remembered being a young man who'd fought in a war to defend a country that didn't defend him, who'd come home to a world that needed changing, and who'd chosen to change it by doing small things with great love. Cutting hair, listening to stories, telling truth to people who needed to hear it. In the end, both men had been right. Ali had been right to refuse induction, to stand on principle when everyone told him to compromise. And Earl had been right to tell him that the path he was choosing would cost everything, but that the cost was worth it. Because 40 years later, the boys who'd sat in Earl's chair talking about Muhammad Ali had grown into men who taught their own children about courage and principle and the importance of fighting for what you believe in. And those children grew into adults who faced their own moments of choice, their own crossroads where comfort and conviction pulled in different directions. And some of them, when they reached those crossroads, remembered the story of a young man who'd walked into a barbershop in Louisville in 1966 and asked an old barber if it mattered. And they remembered the answer, yes, it matters. It costs everything, but it matters. That's the legacy that doesn't appear in highlight reels or documentary films. That's the fight that Muhammad Ali won, not with his fists, but with his presence in a barber's chair on a Wednesday afternoon in October, listening to a man who'd learned through his own life that truth is harder than right or wrong, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is pay the price that mattering requires. Earl's barbershop closed in 1995. Jerome had retired, and no one wanted to take over a business that barely broke even. The building was sold, renovated, turned into a boutique selling vintage clothing to college students. The barber chairs were auctioned off, the mirror was broken during the renovation, the magazines were thrown away. The Coca-Cola clock that ran 5 minutes slow ended up in an antique shop, where someone bought it without knowing its history. But on the corner of West Walnut Street, if you know where to look, there's a small historical marker placed by the Louisville Historical Society in 2018. It reads, Earl's Barbershop stood on this site from 1946 to 1995. Earl Washington, a World War II veteran, cut hair here for 36 years. In October 1966, Muhammad Ali visited this shop and had a conversation with Earl Washington that helped Ali clarify his decision to refuse military induction in 1967. This conversation represented a moment when private counsel between two men shaped public history. It doesn't say what they talked about. It doesn't quote Earl's words or Ali's questions. It just marks the place where it happened, the ordinary location where an extraordinary decision was made. And sometimes people visiting Louisville for the Ali Museum will walk those 3 blocks from the railroad tracks to West Walnut Street. They'll stand in front of that historical marker and try to imagine what that barbershop looked like, what those chairs felt like, what those two men said to each other on an October afternoon in 1966. They can't know, of course. The conversation is lost to history, known only to the two men who had it. But they can know this, that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone isn't to give them answers. It's to give them permission to live with their questions, to tell them that uncertainty is okay, that struggle is okay, that choosing the hard path over the easy one is not just okay, but necessary. That's what Earl Washington did for Muhammad Ali on October 12, 1966. He didn't tell Ali what to do. He told Ali that what Ali already knew he had to do was worth doing, even if it cost everything. And for 47 years after that conversation, until Ali's death in 2016, that permission sustained him through prison sentences, through exile, through stripped titles, through comeback fights, through Parkinson's disease, through all the ways that standing on principle exacts its price. Because on the days when the price felt too high, when the cost seemed unbearable, when compromise looked so much easier than conviction, Ali could remember sitting in a barber's chair in Louisville, listening to a man who'd fought his own wars tell him that the fight was worth it. Not because he'd win, but because it was true. And truth, as Earl Washington said, is harder than right or wrong. But it's also the only thing worth fighting for.